Welcome! This time on Woodworks, we'll build this elegant three-paneled screen with an ebonized frame. Hi, I'm D.Marks. Welcome to Woodworks. Our project this time is a folding screen with some Asian influence to it. This is beautiful to look at and a challenge to build. Let's take a look at these wooden knuckle hinges. Now to make these, we'll require some special woodworking techniques. And that's just one of the many interesting aspects of our project that we're going to be making this time.
We use matched pieces of Australian lacewood for our panels, and the frames are made of maple, ebonized to provide a dark contrast to the lacewood. And the crest rails and wedge-shaped details add dynamic tension to the screen.
These are two of the three panels for our folding screen. Now we've already gone ahead and built two of the three panels just to illustrate to you how this project's going to look. But the techniques in building each one of these sections are identical, so together we're going to build the third one to show you how it's done. Now we've already gone ahead and milled up some maple for our frame stock, so we'll start by making some cuts on the table saw.
Once we cut the rails and stiles for our frame to length, we're ready to begin making our joinery.
Let's take a look at the prototype for our frame. We're going to be using a mortise and loose 10-end construction in our joinery. And because of the design of our crest rail at the top, our rail at the top is going to be a little bit narrower than our rail at the bottom. So what this means is our mortise and tenons are going to be two different sizes.
To cut the mortises, we use the multi-router. It's easy to set up for long stock like our stiles, and because of its versatility, it's perfect for cutting mortises of different sizes.
As we mentioned earlier, we're going to be making two different sizes of tenons for our frame. Now making tenons for furniture is as basic as using nails for carpentry. So we're going to be making a lot of these little guys. So let's talk about the process. We'll start out with a rough piece of wood and go ahead and joint one side straight. Then we'll use the table saw to rip this to width. After that, we'll go to the bandsaw, use that tool to rip it down to thickness. That's going to be a little bit oversized. Then we'll use the planer to go ahead and plane it down to its final dimension. After all that's done, we'll take a router and round these edges, and that way we can get it to fit the rounded corners of our mortise. Now, after we have all that business out of the way, then we come back to the table saw, and we use the stop block down here, clamped in place, and then we can cut our tenon stock to the final length we need to fit our mortise. In order for our folding screen to open and close smoothly, one thing that's really critical is that our wooden hinges fit into these notches in our stiles, and that these notches are cut dead on accurately. Now, an easy way to achieve that is by using a jig like we've made here. We've already cut these notches in it, and that will ensure that our references are very accurately aligned. The way that we use this is to go ahead and drop it into the jig, and then we'll tip it up and pencil out our notches. And after we've gone ahead and made our pencil marks and laid out where the notches will go, then we'll come back with a jigsaw and use this to rough out the bulk of the wood.
Once the notches are roughed out, we clamp the stock back into the jig and use our hand router to finish things up. Our flush bearing bit follows the pattern on the jig and cleans up the notches. The flush bearing bit leaves rounded corners. We need square corners so our hinges won't bind. We'll use our corner chisel to do the job.
As part of the design element for our folding screen, we need to make these wedge cuts at the top and the bottom. Now, it's the proximity of these two angles that creates a certain dynamic tension and really makes a strong statement for our screen. Now, what's important here is that these angles be cut very, very accurately. And to do that, we got a jig. Now, it's often been said that woodworkers spend a lot more time making their jigs than they do making their cuts. And there's some truth to that, but for good reason, because it ensures accuracy and speed.
The jig ensures that all the wedges are cut the same way, and that's important to the symmetry of our design. For more details on building this 3-panel screen, check out our website at DIYnet.com.
Coming up, how to make a strong wooden knuckle hinge.
Welcome back. We're building this elegant 3-paneled screen that features matched lacewood panels.
We've made the joinery for our frame and cut the notches in our stiles. Next, we'll start work on the panel.
For the panels for our folding screen, we're going to need to join together 3 pieces of lacewood to get the 17-inch width that we need. That's because the stock that we've got isn't quite wide enough. Now, this stock is 3/4 of an inch thick, so when we resaw it, that'll give us 2 of the pieces that we need, but we still need a 3rd. Now, this wood has some fantastic medullary Rayfleck grain patterns to it. So the challenge that we face will be joining on that 3rd board and really taking advantage of that grain pattern so that we get the harmony that we need for that 17-inch wide panel.
We resaw our boards on the bandsaw and get a book-matched pair out of each board. The drum sander smooths the surface of the stock and the jointer gives us a flat surface on the edge, which is important for a successful glue-up.
We've just finished dry clamping the 3 pieces for our panel together. This way we can ensure that our joints came out nice and tight. Now, we had some challenges with making sure that all of our grains matched up real nice. And here's how we dealt with it. We had started out with a board that was 3/4 of an inch thick and 16 feet long. We took that board and we cut it into 3 separate lengths. Then we took those lengths and then we resawed those. And you can see we got this beautiful book-matched grain pattern. This is really fantastic. But this only solves 2 pieces of the panel. Now, for the 3rd piece, we took a section of our book match that was further up the length of lumber. We brought it down here. And you can see how these grain patterns match up really nicely. So, by the time we clamp this all together, you can see that all this is going to blend together and look like one solid panel.
We use yellow glue to assemble the pieces for our panel. A good fit is important, and using plenty of clamping pressure will help make our panel appear as one piece of lacewood.
Our next step is to make our wooden hinges for our folding screen. Now, this is essentially a piece of maple that we've drilled some holes into to accept an 1/8-inch brass rod. Now, that brass rod is going to get fitted into our framework, and that's what our whole screen is going to pivot on. Now, one thing that's important to remember is that we want to make sure that our grain is running lengthwise. That way we've got a much stronger hinge. If the grain's running vertically, then the grain's going to be shorter and it could possibly break.
To start the process, we cut some maple hinge stock on the table saw. Next, we take the hinge stock to the router table and round the sides with a radius bit so they'll rotate easily in the frames. Then, using the crosscut sled on the table saw, we cut the hinges to size.
We're drilling the holes for our wooden hinges over here at the drill press. Now, to do this, we're using this tool called a precision machinist vise. Now, what's great about this thing is that it travels in and out on these threaded rods on an XY axis. So that, coupled with a stop block double stick tape in place, will really ensure that these holes are lined up nice and accurately for our brass rod. Now that's important because when we fit these wooden hinges into our framework, we want to ensure that our frame opens and closes very smoothly.
To make the pins, we use a bimetal blade on the bandsaw and cut some brass dowels to length. Then, on the disc sander, we smooth the ends of the pins.
We've already drilled a hole in our wooden knuckle hinge for our brass pin to fit into. Now next up, what we need to do is get this whole assembly to fit into the style for our frame. So in order to do this, we need to cut away some wood here. So we're going to cut a slot, which is sometimes referred to as a kerf, into the side, and that way our brass pin can fit into that slot and our wooden knuckle hinge can drop all the way back into our notch. To do that, we'll use a handheld router with a slot cutting bit in it, sometimes referred to as a kerf cutter. Now this bearing on the bottom is going to rub up against the stock, and the slot cutter will come along the side and cut away the wood for us.
Coming up, how to make a concealed hinge.
Welcome back. We're well on our way making this 3-panel folding screen with wooden knuckle hinges.
We glued up our lacewood panel and made our wooden knuckle hinges. Now we're ready to fit our hinges in our frame.
After we made our kerfs into our stiles, we test fit our wooden hinge and our brass pin into our kerfs and our notches. Now we need to make a little piece of wood to hold that brass pin in place. So we made these little guys. These are called splines. This is a piece of maple that we ripped to width and thickness on the bandsaw. Then we used the drum sander to take it down to its final dimension. After all that, we cut it to length.
We stacked our spline stock and taped it together. Now we'll batch cut a curve on the end of the splines. Then we smooth the curve on the disc sander to match the curves of the slots.
Now that our splines are all milled up, we can go ahead and test the rest of our hinge assembly. Now our brass pin and our wooden hinge is going to fit into this slot in our stile. And we can see we've got a nice snug fit. That's what we're looking for. But also, we want to make sure that this thing pivots back and forth with a real smooth action. Now later on, we'll glue in these splines, and that'll hold our brass pin in place nice and securely. And it'll also cover up our kerf. And then we can trim those off, and it's going to look like one solid piece of wood. For the top of the panels for our folding screen, we wanted to add some visual interest. So we came up with this sort of crest rail design with a semicircular shape in the center. And I made this template out of plywood. We're just using this to draw out our profile onto our maple stock, which will be our top crest rail. So now that we have our pencil lines made out, we're going to go ahead and rough cut this out on the bandsaw. The bandsaw left a rough cut, as you can imagine, on the top portion of our crest rail. Now we want to go ahead and clean that up. So we're over here at the router table. We've got a flush bearing router bit installed. We've taken our template, we've double sticked, and now, as we run it past the bit, this router bearing is going to rub up against our profile template, and the cutters will come in here and cut away that excess wood and leave us a nice smooth cut.
After we clean up the edges of the crest rail, we change to a bevel bit and create a slight bevel on all the exposed edges of the frame. It's a small detail, but a very attractive addition. Next, on the top rail, we use a V-bit to create a subtle groove. This helps accentuate the half dome above it. And finally, we change again to a rabbet cutting bit to make a rabbet in the back of our frame stock where we'll drop in our lacewood panel later on.
We've dry clamped our frame together, and our joints are looking really snug. Now, this is a particularly good time to go ahead and take our measurements for our trim that's going to hold our lacewood panel into the rabbet of our frame. So, we'll get these jotted down, and after we have this reddened up, we can go ahead and glue up the frame, and while the glue's drying, we can go ahead and cut our trim.
Our frame needs to be strong enough on its own to support the panel. The panel won't be glued in, it'll be held in place with trim. This allows the panel to float in the frame. For the trim, we cut some strips of maple to size and cut a rabbet on one side. This gives us a good fit with the frame and panel. Then, we use the chop saw to cut the miters for the corners. At the router table, we finish shaping the edges of the trim with a bevel bit. Finally, we use a hand drill to make pilot holes in our trim and frame so that our screws will fit in easily.
We're using a sharp chisel to square up the corners of our rabbet in our frame. Now earlier, we used a router bit to do some stop rabbets, and as you know, the router bit leaves a rounded corner. So, in order for our lacewood panel to drop into this rabbet, what we need are some nice 90-degree corners. Now this is going to be best accomplished using a nice sharp chisel.
Coming up, a finish that makes maple look like ebony.
Welcome back. Our beautiful 3-panel folding screen is nearly complete.
For more information on making this 3-panel screen, go to our website at DIYnet.com. We shaped our crest rail and glued up our frame. Now we can assemble the panel and hinges for our folding screen.
We're finally at a point in our process where we've got all 3 of our frames fit together. Now we took our lacewood panels out of our first 2 frames, and that's so that we can glue our hinges into our 3rd frame. Now we've been putting a little bit of wax on these brass pins, and that'll just ensure that our hinges will open and close smoothly and that the glue won't stick to the brass pins. So let's go ahead and check our fit. That is looking really nice. Okay, so now we can take our splines, we'll mix up a little bit of 5-minute epoxy, and we can glue these into place.
Once the epoxy is dried, we use a hand plane and scraper to flush up the splines and blend them into the side of the frame.
We're putting the finish on our maple frames. And for design value, we're dyeing the wood jet black. This is often referred to as ebonizing the wood. In other words, making the wood look like ebony. Now the reason that we're not using genuine ebony on this project is because for something of this size would cost thousands of dollars. And for a few dollars worth of dye, we can get a very similar effect, which is that rich jet black look.
For the lacewood panels, we use some tung oil to bring out the figure of the wood. We also use it to give the jet black frame a smooth shine.
Once our screen is dry, we can screw in the trim that holds our panels into our frames. There, that looks outstanding.
The ebonized frames are crowned with crest rails, and the wedge details add an Asian feel to the piece, while the medullary ray-fleck pattern of the lacewood's grain gives the illusion of fabric, making this screen truly one of a kind.
Let me leave you with one last thought. Work a little wax into the hinges, and this will ensure that they'll open and close smoothly for years to come. Thanks for being with us. I'm D.Marks. We'll see you again next time on Woodworks.